My talk today is going to be on how to get your data out of SharePoint and into something like a SQL Server. And that's going to beg the question of, well, first of all, why we would want to do that. Well, we all heard the numbers from the SharePoint conference on adoption. And I don't think anyone would disagree that more and more data is being stored within SharePoint. If you look at data warehousing capabilities, and that's traditionally used with back-end ERP type systems and accounting systems, basically what we do is we take data even out of those things that are absolutely designed for high-performance querying and things like that, and we put them in a format that's more suitable for reporting on. SharePoint, with the data being stored within there, has the benefit of storing an awful lot of data, being very easy to get data into, but it's not necessarily the most performant querying engine. So there's basically a couple of reasons that you'd want to get data out of SharePoint from a performance standpoint. And then also there's not really a whole lot of good tools for working with data that's within SharePoint. So that kind of is the reason we want to be able to do this. So I'm going to walk through basically the approach that we use to get data out and into a data warehouse. But at the same time, you don't lose the ability to work with it. So what we have here is a basic team site with a few things that have been added to it. And I've actually added a list from one of our customers, or a part of a list from one of our customers that's a help desk. And it's pretty typical. You've got information about an issue. You can see this is using InfoPath to edit the form, but it's basic, who the issue's been assigned to, what the issue is about, and what's happened to deal with it. And we've got about 2,000 items in here, and we want to be able to report on, or we want to be able to take the load off of our SharePoint server. So what we need to be able to do is to use a tool called SSIS, and SSIS is SQL Server Integration Services, and it's the standard Microsoft tool that we use to bring the data from the back-end systems and into the data warehouse. And we'll find it. The good news about SSIS is if you're running a SQL Server, any version apart from Express, you already own SSIS, whether or not it's installed. If it is installed, you'll normally find it down here under R2, and actually it's masquerading here under SQL Server Business Intelligence Development Studio, which is kind of an odd name considering what comes up when you fire it up. It's basically Business Intelligence Development Studio is Visual Studio with a few project types added. So to use SSIS, what I'm going to do is the first thing I'm going to do is go in here and create a new project. And you can see these are the project types that get added when you install BIDS, Business Intelligence Development Studio. And there's some analysis services things for working with cubes and report server stuff for working with reports. I'm going to pick an integration services project. This is, by the way, nowhere near as scary as it sounds. I'm going to call this project SQL ShopTalk. And I'm just going to store it in the default areas, and I'm going to click OK. And what we get is basically, a Visual Studio type screen with a canvas, a bunch of actions down the left-hand side. I'm going to, and basically the ability to create what's called a bunch of packages. The package is basically a discrete set of logic that you use when you're working within SSIS, and I'm going to call this SB ShopTalk as well. For just the package, yes. And along the left-hand side, you can see we have a whole bunch of what are called control flow items, and we can do all kinds of things, run SQL, commands, et cetera, et cetera. But the meat and potatoes of SSIS is what's called the data flow task. And we can string these things together, but the data flow task is what lets us take data from one system, make some changes to it if we need to, and pop them into the destination system. If you're at all used to working with workflows in Visual Studio, you'll recognize the interface. I'm going to click on Data Flow Task. You'll see along the at the top we have a new Data Flow item. Or sorry, we've selected the Data Flow tab, and we have a new canvas. So we're basically working within that square. And we have a different set of tools down along the left-hand side. We have Data Flow Sources, Data Flow Transformations, and Data Flow Destinations. And what you'll notice up here, somewhat confusingly under the data flow sources section, is we have a SharePoint list destination and a list source. Yes, destination should probably be down below, but that's the way it is. These two items do not come out of the box when you have SSIS. So if you just go to your machines and fire SSIS, chances are you won't see that. That's no different, by the way, even with the next version of SQL Server 2012. SharePoint is not considered basically a valid data source by the SQL team. Not sure why that is, but it's why it is. However, luckily, out there on CodePlex, there is a project, and I'm just going to click on the page for it right here, that adds these two functions in. And I'm going to put the link in the chat window, and hopefully everybody can see that. If you go ahead and download the SharePoint List Adapter Setup, you'll see these two items. They should show up in your data flow sources section here, and if they don't, what you'll need to do is go up to Tools, choose Toolbox Items. I'm not going to do that because it'll take a little too long. You'll be able to select them and add them in there. And in addition, if you need any help or anything really in-depth as to how to get this stuff going, I'm going to paste another link in here. There's a blog post that's out there by the Data Queen. Where are we here? Here we go. Who works with me and coincidentally is my wife, so you can imagine what life at our house is like. But basically, this is a nice long walkthrough on exactly how to use this in great detail. So if you miss anything what I'm talking about today or you want to go dive in there, I'd suggest you start here. So the first thing we want to do is start with the SharePoint list source. So I'm going to drag a list source onto my Canvas screen. You can see I've got a little red X, which means it hasn't been configured yet. All I got to do to configure is double click it. And the first thing it wants to know is, what's my connection manager? And I don't have anything here. So what I have to do before I do anything else is go down here to this connection manager tab. I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a new connection. It doesn't show up as any of the default connections, but I'm going to add a new connection. Up comes our screen. We'll go down here to SPC Red, which is the connection manager now for SharePoint connections. This also gets added when we install that project. I'm going to click Add. It's going to basically say, what are the credentials you're going to use to connect back into SharePoint? In my case, I'm just going to leave it alone as the credentials of the executing process. But in most cases, you're going to want to explicitly state how you're going to connect back to SharePoint. That'll basically determine what your privileges are when you're reading from that list. You should use some kind of a least privilege account for that. So I've just created that. Now I'm going to go back into my source connection. I'm going to pick that as my connection manager. And then I'm going to go over here to component properties. And there are a number of items we fill out under component properties. There are two we really care about, the site URL and the site list name. For the site URL, I'm going to go back now to my service requests list, go up here and grab my site URL, not the entire URL, not the URL including the list, but just the site URL. And I'm going to paste that guy in there. And the list name is the display name of the list. So in this case, I believe it's service requests. And that's all we really have to enter here. There are a number of other options, including a camel query. So if you're really, really brave, you can go in there and build out some camel and restrict the results that you're getting back. That's going to help with performance, and or you may just want to archive specific items. But you could also use a view that you've created in your list and name the view here and use that to filter out your items. I'm just going to get them all. The next thing I'm going to do is click on the column mappings tab. That's just going to take a second while it goes out and reads all of the fields from SharePoint. So you can see this down here along the external columns, basically, are the columns that it's reading by default from SharePoint. I can decide to use all of them or none of them. And what it's done is created columns that exist in what's called the data flow path. And that's internal to SSIS. And that'll make more sense in just a second. And basically, there's a one-to-one relationship, except it's done things like map whatever the data type was here. So if we said, say, target close, which should be a date field, if you go over here to target close, sorry, to demonstrate this, I need to go over to this tab, which is showing me the external columns, which is my basically source list, and the output column. So here's my target close, and here's all the information about the field. It's figured that out for me. I don't have to pre-create any of that stuff. And you can see it's got the data type right. So if
John?
you wanted to control, yes.
I believe there's a question. It says, is the view name a guide?
GUID, I see. Yeah, no, the view name is actually just the, it should just be the name of the view. I can't tell you off the top of my head. I could dig into that. The blog post should tell you that, as well as there's some documentation you can download from the project that'll get into that kind of detail. Thanks. Okay, so is that good? Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to click OK. So now we have our SharePoint list source configured, and the next thing we want to do now is and this is going to be really, really simple. This is all hello world stuff. I'm going to drag an OLADB destination. There's a few ways of talking to SQL data. OLADB is pretty performant on SSIS, so I tend to use that one. And then I'm just going to connect that arrow onto my OLADB destination. I now need to configure that. I'm going to double click on the box, and we can see we don't have any connection manager here, but I can create it right from here. I do have a connection back into that database already, so I'm not going to bother going ahead and creating it. But if you wanted to, I could click New, and everyone knows how to fill out this dialog box. If you haven't seen this before, I'd be surprised. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that connection. So that's our new OLADB connection manager. I have a number of ways of working with the data. I could just use a query if I want. I'm just going to stick with table or view. And it's basically asking me what table or view name I want to use, and it's reaching out into the database and finding out what's there. If it doesn't already exist, I can click New, which is what I'm going to do, and it's giving me the ability to create a new table. And if I'm going to go to SP ShopTalk, it's going to be the name of my table. I'm going to click OK, and just by doing that, it's gone and created the table. Let's go over here to the SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to connect in. I'm going to open up the database. I'm going to open up SP Data Warehouse, and you'll see there's our SP ShopTalk table that we've just created. And I'll just do a quick query on it so you can see it's empty. All right. And nothing up my sleeve, that kind of thing. So we've created the table, and then now we need to do the mappings. Same sort of process, except we have the input columns, and those were basically from that path that I was talking about before. And then it's basically saying, here are the columns that are available in the table that you've just created, and how do we want them to map out? You may not always want them to map a one-to-one. You may be only pulling a few pieces of information, and the fields may not have the same name, et cetera, et cetera. But in our case, it's just a one-to-one relationship. It's going very simply. We've got our SharePoint list source. We've got our OLADB destination. And from here, we can just hit Go to run a debug. And what you're going to see here, it compiles, and then we go yellow. So right now we're querying our SharePoint list. Takes just a second. And once it gets that list queried, it'll basically blast through and populate out our SQL table. Any day now, here we go with the status update. So we've got 1,996 rows that we've moved over into SQL. And just to show you how that worked, I'm going to pop back over here, rerun our query, and you can see now in inverse order we've got items ID 4,000 down to whatever it is, and here's all of the data we had. It's coming from SharePoint. And you'll know it's SharePoint data. You can see some of the oddness around SharePoint data, like assignee and user. All right. I would normally ask, does anybody know what these are? These are basically person fields. Okay. And a person fields, I remember, I think a few weeks ago we were talking about throttling, and it came up how we're restricted to how many lookup fields we can have in a single list. And we were pointing out that person fields counts toward that limit. And the reason is that at the end of the day, it's really just a lookup field into the person list for the site collection. And any lookup field has this kind of a format. It's got the ID of the source item, a semicolon, and a hashtag, and then the actual name that's used for display. Well, that's great for SharePoint, but SQL doesn't know anything about this. And if we're going to be reporting back to users, we really don't want to have that format. So what we want to do, and this is just going to get into the T part, and I don't know if I explained that. I talked about SSIS's SQL Server Integration Services. It's a category of product called ETL. There are other ETL products out there, and ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. So you've seen extract and load. We really didn't do much in the way of transformation. So we're going to go do just a little bit of that now. We want to get rid of that 210 and the hashtag. We'll show you how that how easy that is to do here. However, the first thing we need to realize is we've already loaded that table. We don't want to just load it up again with new information. So I'm going to pop back over here to the control flow. I'm going to throw in a SQL task. Execute SQL task right at the beginning. I'm going to connect that SQL task now to my data flow. I'm going to configure my SQL task to use my basic connection that's in there. And then I'm just going to basically issue a command to clear out that table. This is just a simple SQL truncate table SP ShopTalk. All right, and I'm going to click OK. And so now every time I run this job, the first thing that will happen is that will run. It'll clear out the table, and then we're going to go repopulate it. And so I'm going to pop back in here. I'm just going to pull this down a little bit. I'm going to sever the connection between these two for the moment, and I'm going to put in what's called a derived column. And a derived column is basically a way to either create or modify columns as they flow, as they move along the data flow path. So I'm going to connect my list source to my derived column, and then I'm going to connect my derived column to my destination. And without doing anything, the data will just simply flow through it. But what I want to do is go in here and I want to change the user column. And I'm going to have to, it's always the hardest part. And well, first the assignee column, and then the user column. And here we go. So if I take that and replace it with an expression, I have a bunch of options I can pick from in terms of expressions. There's all kinds of ltrims and replace and find characters. I just have a function I've already pre-built, so you don't have to watch me struggle with it. And for assignee, they're basically the same function, just running on different fields. And I'm going to paste this into user. And in English, without getting into it, find string basically tells me what position of the character that I find something in. In this case, I'm looking for the hash mark, or the hashtag. And then I'm passing that into a substring function, basically saying, go to that point in the string, add 1 to that, and then give me the next 150 characters as a result of that. So that should strip out the name part of those two fields. Okay, so now we're ready to run. Let's go back over to control flow. I'm going to hit go. And as it's running, you're going to see, first of all, the execute task, SQL task goes quickly. I'll pop over to the data flow. We'll see what's happening. We're again reading from our SharePoint list source. The slowest part. Okay, and away we go. Transform them. Bang. They should be in there. I'm going to hit stop. Rerun our query, and we should see, please, we should see that our user fields and our assignee fields have got that stuff stripped out. So now we've done a complete ETL. There's a whole lot of stuff you can do with SSIS. This is just scratching the surface. But we've done what we basically need to do, get that data out of SharePoint and into SQL. Well, that's great. Let's assume we were going to go and delete that data from SharePoint, and I'm not going to go ahead and do that right now. But if we were, how are we going to see that back in SharePoint? How are we going to keep working with it in SharePoint? We got two options, basically. We could use BCS, and we can report on it. There's probably more than two options, but those are the ones I'm going to touch on today. So to start with, we're used to working with that stuff as a list. Maybe we should just create it as another list. What we want to do is use BCS to create an external content type to read that data, and then we're going to show that data in SharePoint as an external list. To do that, we're going to need to run SharePoint Designer, connect into our site. Okay, we're going to go over here to external content types. That takes just a second, and you can see I've got one here that's already completed, just in case everything goes all pear-shaped. But I'm just going to, I basically went up to the ribbons, create a new external content type. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to SP ShopTalk. It has the same name. And then I'm going to go out and discover the external data sources. Now what you can see here is we've already got a data source defined, and it's actually connecting to exactly what we need to connect to. But I'm going to go ahead and add another connection that's going to go to it, so you can see how this works. First thing it asks is what type of connection are we making, so we can have a web service, a .NET type, but more commonly, SQL Server is what we're going to use. It's going to ask us what the name of the server is. It's SP2010. The database name is SP Data Warehouse. And I'm going to give it a name, SP ShopTalk. And then we have some security or connection options. So if I'm basically going to connect to, or select today, connect with the user's identity. I can do that because I've got absolutely everything running on the same server. If I don't have everything running on the same server, I'm going to need, to be able to use this, I'm going to need to basically have Kerberos installed so that it can pass credentials around. Or I can use one of these other options. I can use an impersonated identity. Either one of these have the same constraints. Basically, the difference between the two is if I want to connect to SQL, I'm going to be using basically using Windows authentication, like a domain account. I'm going to need to use this one. And if I want to connect using SQL credentials, I'm going to be using the custom identity. But to use either one of these, you're going to have an application set up in the Secure Store service, and that's another shared service application you can get to through Central Admin. There's a whole thing about setting all of those up, and actually I've got a blog entry on how to do that with Excel and cubes and things like that, if you're interested. One thing to note about this as well, if you want to use this stuff, BCS works with SharePoint Foundation, but you don't get a secure store service with SharePoint Foundation. However, you do get a secure store service with Search Server Express, which is also free, which gives you everything you have with Foundation Plus. So I always recommend that the customers, if they're considering Foundation, that they just go that extra step and go to Search Server Express. But that's an aside. So I'm going to go ahead and connect with the user's identity. It's gone out, and I'm going to open this up. It's going to see what tables do we have in here, and there's the table we care about. I'm going to open that up. Sorry, I'm going to right-click on my table. And what I need to do to work with BCS is read an item and read the list. I don't need the other options. Basically, you can do read-write operations with BCS, but all I need to do is be able to read the list. So I'm just going to quickly click that. I'm going to accept the defaults. I'm going to click Next. I should give it a filter parameter. I'm not going to right now, but that's basically to basically throttle back performance. I need to give it an identifier, so the ID field is probably a logical choice for me. And then we need to give, basically it's giving you warnings down here, no fields have been selected to show in the external item picker. So if it brings up a list of items, what do we display to the user if they want to do a selection? Basically we're saying what is the analog of the SharePoint title field, and I'm going to basically select description is going to be used to show in the picker. And then the last warning is basically telling me that in SQL the ID field could be null, and it doesn't like that idea, nor should it. I should go back into SQL and set that, but we're not going to worry about that for our purpose today. I'm going to click Finish, and then I'm going to basically, you can see one of our operations is here. I'm going to go create another operation, which is the read item. And it's just a little bit quicker. I need to basically do the same thing with mapping to the identifier. Click Next, do the same thing here, and we're off to the races. Okay, so we've got our two basic items created. I'm going to save it. And you can see what it's saying. The changes to this item, I don't know, it went away pretty quickly, but it's basically saving back to the BCS shared application, okay? So from here, if I can just directly create an external list. That's what I'm going to go ahead and do. Basically saying, what's the name of my new external list? I'm going to call it SP ShopTalk. What operation do I use to read the item? It's picked the right one, the only one at the moment. I could give it a description, and I could rate even from here to say, go ahead and create an info path form for editing. I'm not going to bother to do that today. I would normally recommend that you do that. I'll click OK. And boom, we've got ourselves an external content type. So now if we go back over here into our service requests and we say site actions, view all site content, we should see SP ShopTalk has been created here as an external list, okay? And if we click on it, we're going to see an error. Access denied by business connectivity. This is a gotcha. Gets most people every time.
I love those. I spend half the week doing those.
Yeah, search down the
There
correlation
are like
ID.
5 different places you have to look at least.
Well, this one's nice and easy. This was a setup. It's just because, to me, shouldn't SharePoint Designer say, hey, what rights do you want to give to this item? But it doesn't. You have to go in through Central Admin.
Or hire a consultant.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so forget what I just said. So, sorry. So we have to go in here. We got to go into Managed Service Applications, Business Data Connectivity Services, and you can see that's the object we just created. This, by the way, in 2007 was a nightmare to create, but now it's nice and easy with Designer. But it doesn't do absolutely everything for you, so I guess I shouldn't complain. But anyway, what we have to do is go in here and basically say set permissions. Who gets to use this object? And we got our nice little claims screen up here. I always click that add button first, and I'm stupid, but anyway. I'm going to search for the term authenticated because I'm going to give everybody access to it. I'm following all the worst practices today. Add OK, and add that in. So now that we have this in the list, I'm going to give them rights to do absolutely everything. Again, worst practices. Okay, so I've basically just granted access to that. If I go back now here to my error and I hit F5, I still get the error. Uh-oh, what did I do? Did I miss something? Shoot. I'll go to my pre-baked one if that doesn't work, but I just want to try it one more time.
Yeah, I was, I know you've probably done this a million times too, but I was doing this the other day too, and I went to the set permissions and I put everything in here that I thought was correct. But then you have to get that drop-down box at the top. I discovered that I had to go to that drop-down box and go to all the different, see where it says external content types?
Yep.
In that drop-down box at the very top.
No, where? Oh, yeah. I don't actually.
No. The drop-down box.
Oh yeah, this guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
The view. Yeah.
I had to go in there, and I had to go to like several other places and go and change the permissions in there. It took me like a couple of hours to figure this out, though, and I was just like, got so mad.
Oh, that's brutal.
So just FYI for those of you who troubleshoot this stuff all the time.
Exactly. Sometimes as well, it takes time.
That's
and
true.
I think it did
yeah.
in this case.
That's frustrating
too
because we weren't sure if it was something that we had just changed or if it just took a few minutes.
Yeah. So I'm just ripping through this too quickly. That's why we got there. Fair enough. Yeah, it can be a bear to debug, and especially when you throw that the secure store service in the middle. So that gets really evil. But in any event, so what you can see here is we've got an external list. I'm going to go back up to the list just because it's a list, not quite like anything else, but a lot like anything. I'm just going to go into the modify the view. Do things like I'm sorting by ID, but I'll sort it in reverse order. Click OK. Just so you can see, we've got item number 4000. There's the Graven collector, modem connection. You can see all the information there. Obviously, the data, like we've got HTML files that come in as string. We need to pretty that up. But then we could also go back to our original list, and you can see it's exactly the same item, right? So although we've taken the data outside of SharePoint and stuck it in SQL, we can still see it in SharePoint, and the crawler can index the data. So we haven't really lost anything from a historical standpoint, but we've gained from a performance standpoint. I just want to check how we're doing on time. Okay, so another option we have for getting at that data is not through the traditional list, is to go into, basically I've got reporting services integrated mode set up in here, and I've got a reports list that supports all the data types, and we've got a few of them already pre-created. So if I can go in here real quickly, and I'm going to, oh, I always hit the wrong item. So if I go into documents, I want to create a new connection, or a new data source, sorry, and I'm going to call this SQL ShopTalk. I'm real creative with my names today, aren't I? So here's Microsoft's SQL Server is going to be my data type. And with reporting services, you can connect to a whole bunch of data types, like, oh, I don't know, directly to analysis services, Oracle, AWS, Azure, very important. But anyway, we're going to stick with SQL Server for the moment. So control. I'm just going to paste that in. Same issues here, and there's a whole, we could talk for hours about, what's the best way to authenticate back in. I'm just going with the Windows authentication because I can get away with it right now. I'm going to click Test Connection. I'm going to go ahead and enable this data source, and we've got our data source connected, or created. So now we can create, back up here to documents, a new document. And here's something actually surprisingly few people know exists, which is Report Builder version 3. If you've got reporting services in integrated mode on SharePoint, you have this tool. And that's basically a power user tool for developing reports on SharePoint. I'm going to create the world's dumbest report, but you'll see how it's done real quickly. I'm going to use a table or matrix wizard. I'm going to go ahead and create a data set, and the data set is effectively part of the report. I'm going to create a connection to a data source. I'm going to click, oops, sorry, I didn't want to create a new one. I want to browse for my data source. So you can see this is my site. I know that the data source I just created was in reports. I'm going to click SP ShopTalk, open, test my connection. I'm good. So I click next. What am I going to report on? Well, I'm going to go into my SharePoint ShopTalk table. I'm just going to grab everything for now because I'm lazy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use those user and assignee fields that we cleaned up. Well, I just want a quick matrix to see who's assigned what to whom. So I'm going to say these users, the user is going to be in rows, the assignee is going to be in the groups, and I'm just going to use the ID field in here in values. But I don't want to sum up the ID fields. I'm just going to pick a different aggregate. So the stuff in the aggregated values obviously needs to have an aggregate function applied to it. And what I'm going to do is just basically count them. So we're going to have a report here of how many help desk tickets that the users have assigned to the assignees. I'm going to click next. What style do I want to work, or basically how do I want this to work? And if I'm going to be doing grouping, I could have things expand and collapse and indent, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just accepting defaults. What theme do I want to apply to it by default? Ocean is fine. I'll go in here. I'll do something like SP ShopTalk report, except with the X. All right. I can add columns here. I can do all kinds of things. I put in maps. I've actually been working on a big mapping project in Reporting Services Azure for the last few days, so it's on the top of my head. But I'm just going to leave this alone. I'm going to hit, when I'm ready to test it, I can hit run. And that's going to do a client-side render of what we're talking about. So we can see here that David Chason right here has assigned 11 items to Colleen Judges and so on. It's, this is no real winner of a report, but if we scroll down to the bottom, we get totals by default and all of that stuff, and we can see there's our 1,996 items, which if you remember from the data flow is how many items came across all told. So if I decide I like this is a great thing, I want to share this with everyone, I can just hit save. Up comes again my SharePoint site. I'm going to open up reports. Untitled, it's going to be SP ShopTalk RDL. I'm going to save that off and close out this, refresh my page, and we can see I've got a report here for SP ShopTalk that I can then open in the browser, and there, it works. That's basically, those are your reports. You can get very, very fancy with these reports. Just so you can see, we have on here, and this is taken from the customer site, in fact, the management dashboard, and this is just basically a SharePoint page with a single filter and a number of reports. The resolution I'm using here doesn't really lend itself to showing this too well, but I'll show you these basic concepts. We can see, first off, we have an assignee performance report, and we can see we've got a Jack Guest. I can expand this. We can see the types of issues he's been working with, and if I click on this, I can drill right in and get line item level detail of what those reports were. If I scroll a little to the right, normally you wouldn't have to scroll. We can see, open tickets by assignee. We can see overdue open tickets by department, all kinds of interesting stuff. And it's all driven by these two filters down here. They've got default values, which is beginning of the year and the current date. But I could just pick, let's just keep in mind down here. So we've got an average response of 100 response to issues of 171.86%, mostly because we've got this one wonky outlier here. But I'm just going to pick a different date so you can see how this works. And because these are these filter fields, it's going out now, it's setting the parameters on these reports. And you can see that number has changed. So it's based on those two date parameters. You can also see that from an overdue standpoint, there is one item left from back then still open. But what you've got there is single filters or two filters are driving all of these reports all together. Okay, so you can get really fancy with reports. That's really the only part of that that I needed to show you. And then finally, the last piece of what I wanted to talk about today was now that we've got that, now that we've got our data flow set up, how do we set it so that this runs on a regular basis? So we want to drop that table, say, every night and populate it with data. Well, the first thing we have to do is go back in here to our project, which is our integration services project. I have to check properties. It doesn't do this by default. But if we go into the deployment utility, we can say create deployment utility, true. I apply that property. I then rebuild the solution. I then go in here and I go into SP ShopTalk, into the bin folder under deployment, and you get this file, SSIS deployment manifest. All you have to do is double click on it to run it. We're going to deploy it out to SQL Server. The SQL Server we're going to deploy it to is local. We can use that. We're going to use Windows Authentication again. What path? Where do we want to put it? I'm just going to put it in the root. So I'm going to select SSIS packages. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to click Next. There we go. That's where it's going to go on the file system. And Next. That's now installed on the SQL Server. So from here, we go back over to here to Management Studio. Is everybody getting tired from getting whipped around here yet? We go back to Management Studio. We can collapse down our databases. And, oops, sorry, we keep the server open though. Down here you have the SQL Server agent. It doesn't run automatically when you do a straight up SQL install. You need to have it set to run by default. But it basically is, think of it as a fancy scheduler. It does all your maintenance tasks and things like that. And what we're going to do is add an agent job in here. And if I open up jobs, we can see we've got a couple in here already. Well, I'm going to go over here to jobs, right click on it, and I'm going to create a new job. I'm going to call it SP ShopTalk. Okay, I'm going to go down to steps, and I'm going to create a new step. And you can have any number of steps in these jobs. And I'm going to go get data is the name of our steps. What type of a step is it? It's an integration services package. Okay, so it's going to run as this account. And don't forget, we've got connection strings we've created already. So we may or may not care what the identity of this account is. It's going to, where's the source? Where does this package live? It's going to be on our SQL Server, the one that we've just deployed to. SP 2010, we're going to go ahead and use it, Windows Authentication to connect to it. And I'm going to find, there's our SP ShopTalk package that we created. I'm going to click OK, and then OK. And so we've created that step. This will be a one-step job. And finally, we're going to go down here to schedule. I'm not going to go ahead and schedule it, but you can see from the screen we could create, daily. We can pick, occurs every day, how often, when, and you can get down to repeats down to the second if you want to. The real-world example that I showed you, the dashboard stuff from, runs hourly in their particular case. So I'm not going to go ahead and create that schedule. I'm just going to save off this job. And if you ever want to force it, you can just basically say start job at step, and it's going to go ahead and run. We only have one step, so it just goes ahead and runs. And it's basically going and putting putting the other data back in. So I think that's a whirlwind how to get data out of SharePoint and put it back in there so you can still use it. That's all I got for you today. Really.
John.
That was pretty extensive.
Yeah.
Sorry, a bit of a whirlwind, but yeah.
We did have a question that was around this topic earlier, but so I said we would ask these questions like right after your talk. So I'm going to give Daniel the floor. Daniel, give me 2 seconds to unmute you, and you can answer questions directly to. Oh, he doesn't have an audio pen. I'm going to have to read the question to you. Daniel, I just sent you an audio pen. If you are able to use that, you can begin talking. But if not, I'm just going to ask the question for you as best as. Oh, here you go. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I've been working with AvePoint and the DocAv product, and I'm getting it to chuck out audit reports as CSV files. Now they're not much use really. They're just very big tables. And I was hoping to sort of use SSIS to get them to display them, and I could use some of the techniques you described with the agent and the like. But I really want to sort of give me the brief outline of what I need to do to get it displayed, get some decent reports on the audit data.
Well, the report, it's audit. It's interesting you mentioned audit. I'm going to take us to the side for just a minute because there is actually something I forgot to mention. One of the bigger uses that I have for this technique, I just showed you how to do this for operational data, but one of the problems we have with workflows is the workflow history list. And just for everyone's benefit, I'm sure I don't need to explain this one to Laura, but when you run a workflow and that workflow is logging items to the history list, every one of those items becomes a separate list item in that list. And you can bump up against the 2,000, 5,000, whatever the 20,000 item limit is in those lists very, very quickly, and performance starts to really, really suffer. In central admin, there's a timer job that runs, and by default, I think it's 60 days, where it severs the connection basically between the source item and the workflow history list items. Those list items still exist, but you're not hammering on them, so it basically reduces the performance problem. From an audit standpoint, this is killer because you can't just go back and retrace the steps for the workflow history. Luckily, the data is still there, but you can't see it. So what we like to do is basically take all of the data greater than 60 days old and pump them back into the data warehouse, create a report for that you can show in SharePoint. And so now you've got complete auditability of all your workflow history list items. And then we trim out anything older than 60 days. We basically can, there's a number of ways you can do that out of that list. So to come back to your question, CSV files, depending on where you want to store them, you could use this tool to take the CSV data, put it in SharePoint. Let's say you had to run some kind of approval or a workflow against that data. Well, you could do that, or you could just basically take the CSV files and stuff them into SQL. That's a very, very common use of SSIS. You could, if you have some automated process that dumps CSV files into a folder, you can loop through all the CSV files, make some determinations, and figure out where they need to go based on data that's contained within them, et cetera, et cetera. SSIS can get very, very complex.